Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Tea with the Trustee webinar. Our topic for today is a current view of the settlement issues for pension schemes from a trustee perspective. My name is Tiziana Perrella. I've been a professional trustee since 2020, was previously a settlement consultant and broker for a period of over 20 years. And I'm currently working with 12 schemes, varying in size from under 10 million to about 500 million. And these are a mixture of sole and co-trustee appointment. There is significant settlement activity on my current appointments, going from the preparatory stage to schemes that are currently in the market or that are going through a buyout and wind-up process.
Good afternoon from me. My name's Charles Ward. I'm a professional trustee looking after a range of schemes, either as sole trustee or as co-trustee. Majority of my schemes are relatively well funded and looking at options for moving towards some form of settlement in the coming years. The focus is very much therefore on data and the investment journey between now and the time when those schemes will approach the market so that we can access the best terms in exchange for putting forward a well-prepared scheme.
Great, thank you, Charles. I'll just start with a quick recap of last year. Last year was again a good year. There were 29 billion worth of business written over the year. That was a little bit less, roughly 10% less than the previous year. But actually breaking down the figures, there were more transactions that were completed last year than in the last couple of years. And the reduction in total business written was driven by a smaller number of very large transactions. There were only 4, where in 2019, which was a record year, there were 10 bulk annuity transactions over £1 billion. But actually, this is great news for smaller schemes. And 2/3 of transactions, we understand, were completed for schemes that were, or the transactions were under 100 million in size. And the other interesting aspect was that there were more deferred only or deferred heavy transactions, and there were great pockets of pricing for these. And the appetite from insurers remained very high. And that's also helped by all insurers active in the market at the moment being able to write full scheme buyouts. L&G again had a very successful year. Aviva had the best year ever. And there was good growth also for some of these smaller players, such as Canada Life and Just. And of course, a fantastic year for Standard Life, who were able to write some very large transactions. So really, the position was more balanced, maybe, between insurers than in previous year. And that shows that there is some ongoing market segmentation. But that, again, is not bad news at all. It just means that there are takers out there for schemes of all shapes and sizes. Charles, do you want to go through what all of this means for trustees?
Yeah, so I suppose the fact that we've got such a busy market means there's an onus on us as trustees to keep up with market developments, not just in the insurance space, but also in the broader consolidation space, whether that's super fund or capital-backed solutions that are out there that could work for our schemes. I think it's important that we don't just kind of understand what the options and products are, but also what process we need to go through as trustees to understand which of those solutions could work in the circumstances that face each of our schemes. And importantly, we need to get the right advice so that we can navigate that in the most effective way possible. And the result of that is that we're certainly seeing an increasing trend for appointing the settlement advisor much earlier in the scheme's journey, potentially even as early as looking at some kind of member option exercises early on and taking that all the way through the investment journey, the data journey, right through to the transaction itself, not just waiting until the last minute to bring someone in to help us to find the right insurance solution. So the other aspect to think about is a member perspective. So at what point do we start communicating with our members about what we're doing with the scheme, particularly if there is insurance on the horizon, start warming members up to that and bring them along on the journey with us. So on that note, Tiziana, could you take us through the themes we're seeing this year as trustees?
Yes, absolutely. So we've definitely seen a lot more tenders and appointments be made on the basis of specific in-depth settlement experience, which clearly we're very, very happy about. And I think that makes perfect sense, because you're talking about really substantial exercises with equally large costs attaching. And if something goes wrong, not only a lot of money has been spent needlessly, but also insurers have long memories, so it can go against schemes. And so really there is no scope to get things wrong. And also the interesting aspect is that for some very large schemes, the switch to sole, and for some of them, they did not even have a professional trustee on board before. And this is specifically to manage settlement projects and manage the scheme endgame. One aspect really is that, of course, there's a lot of work that goes on with these exercises. And really, this is a key point in the lifetime of a scheme. So there is a big risk, really, that very good and useful historical knowledge is lost once a scheme transitions. And I'm thinking about past discretionary practices or specific categories of members with special entitlement. And one trend, again, that we have seen is that there are consultative committees that can be appointed even when there is a sole appointment in place, made up of components from either previous trustees or the company, or indeed both. And they really stay on to support the new trustee for a period. And this is a system that actually can work very well to make sure that transfer of information is as efficient and as complete as possible. Do you want to talk about green endgames?
Yeah, so our kind of recent experience of what we're seeing in the space of endgames and planning ahead for settlement, I think it goes without saying that if buyout's affordable, either because of the scheme's funding position or the strength of the sponsor covenant, then that still remains the gold standard for any of our schemes, pretty much without exception. And interestingly, what we've seen, particularly over the last 6 months, is a result of increasing yields and also improving buyout pricing. Actually, some schemes have found themselves in a position where they're in a far better funding position than they were in before, which has surprised some sponsors in particular. And actually then that's generated a need to act fairly quickly to try and either lock in those gains or even move further and try and transact with an insurer, which potentially can be difficult if the data is not ready yet. So really what we're keen to do is have more open discussions with sponsors in advance of these things happening, on two fronts really. Firstly, at what point is the sponsor willing, if at all, to write a check to top up funding to get the scheme into a position where it can buy out, and understand what that number is so that everyone is clear and that the expectations on both sides are understood. But equally, what would happen if the scheme were to end up in a surplus because of the way markets moved over time, really just to avoid having that debate at what could otherwise be a very busy time for the scheme. So understanding what the treatment of surplus would be, what the rules say, what the sponsor's view is, what the trustee's view is, etc. So really important to have those conversations in advance, but also then to consider maybe broader issues for the sponsor if a transaction is in prospect, particularly for those sponsors with US or who sit within a US group, understanding the accounting treatment, particularly where that ultimate parent is listed, and there could be quite a material impact on their financial statements. So making sure that everybody understands the impact of that, so that if necessary, the sponsor can start to warm up their investors to this transaction that maybe is coming down the line, and to explain what will happen if and when that transaction is executed. So really important to do all that work in advance, but also educate the sponsor around the preparatory work that's needed and make sure that's done in a measured way. Again, the last thing you want to do is do a lot of that kind of data work and broader kind of benefits work right at the last minute. So get that done as early as possible. That really has manifested in a continuation of a theme that we've seen for many years, which is pulling together a joint working group, whether that's formal or informal, where the sponsor and we as trustees work together, including the appointment of the risk advisor to manage the whole project from start to end, so that everybody's got clear responsibility. There are clear touch points in terms of reporting. There's a clear timeline for what we're doing, and just to make the process as painless as possible from everybody's perspective. So really preparation is everything. I made that sound relatively easy. So Tiziana, could you talk us through some of the challenges that we're seeing on the ground? Tiziana?
Sorry, just having some connectivity problems there. Yeah, I think that preparation piece is really, really important. And we are still finding that a lot of schemes have got significant issues with the data, not least a big issue as far as pricing is concerned and as far as funding is concerned, which is equalization. And of course, most administrators are very, very busy with various pieces of work. So if you've got any rectification work that needs to be done, it's probably quite difficult to fit in with your incumbent. And I just have said this before, and I probably will say it again, this kind of work really should be ongoing for any scheme that has got an end game of settlement. There should be a benefit specification that is drafted and is legally reviewed, and that should really form the basis of a benefit audit for each scheme. And clearly the scope of the benefit audit will depend on the circumstances of each scheme, but it's very, very unlikely that even the best run schemes don't benefit from those sort of processes. And if the incumbent administrator is strained, there are now a number of third-party providers that can come in and can help trustees resolve data issues. But again, there is kind of limited experience in this space. We've had some very good experience with this, but really it pays off to start work as early as possible. I have got a case now where we've had a quotation from an insurer kind of monitoring the position, and it's really attractive, but really we are not able to move because the data is not quite in a fit state, that we will be able to do that without any concerns. And data alongside governance sits really at the top of the insurer's triage list when they decide whether they're going to quote for a scheme or not. So again, this is something that I see as really as a major challenge. But of course, and as you have alluded to, Charles, buyout is not the only game in town anymore. So maybe do you want to pick up some of the other options available to pension schemes?
Yeah, I'll just finish off on this part of the presentation, just a view of what we're seeing more broadly. I think as trustees, we welcome any innovation in this market beyond buyout, particularly for those schemes who don't see that as a realistic aspiration at any point in time, either because of the sponsor covenant or the very poor funding position of the scheme. So, yeah, I think it's important that any innovation can be positive, but from a trustee perspective, it's really important for us to understand where those solutions sit and what they mean in terms of the support for the scheme in the future. So really understanding, does the solution sit on the employer's balance sheet, in which case from the solutions that we've seen, particularly the more capital-backed solutions, that's an enhancement to covenant because we're getting something on top of what the employer can provide to us, and hopefully gives us a bit more certainty about the journey to buyout that we're on. Clearly more challenging then are those solutions where the scheme is moving off balance sheet and we're losing the employer covenant, particularly some of the consolidators and super funds. In those situations, really important and quite challenging really to understand the contribution we're getting towards funding and how that compares to the employer covenant that we're giving up. But in the right circumstances, those solutions may well be appropriate, particularly where there's a UK sponsor, for example, in a multinational group, where the UK sponsor's covenant isn't great, but there's some support that can be provided from the parent. So lots of innovation, lots of lots of options for us. And so it's really important to understand those circumstances, understand which of those solutions are appropriate in each circumstance, but then also making sure that the process we go through to assess those solutions is robust and certainly stands up to any challenge from members in the event that we move forward and implement those solutions. Once you've decided on the direction of travel, monitoring is obviously key, making sure that we actually implement at the right time, particularly for those schemes that are a little bit further away from settling their liabilities. So lots of interesting stuff going on and lots of options, but really important that everyone understands and goes into these things with their eyes open. So at that point, I'm going to just kind of close off on the more formal part of the conversation and ask Caroline, have we got any questions?
Hi, Charles. Yes, we do have a question. I'll just start off with the first one. Are there any differences between large and small schemes in the terms of preparation?
I will take that one. Yes, there are huge differences, really. Smaller schemes, they are following really a commoditized almost process, and they need to be spot on in terms of preparation, as in the data needs to be of very good quality indeed. They need to have the right matching assets and so on. Where large schemes have got a lot more options, really. For example, contractually, they could go for residual risk, or there may be an element of an in-specie payment of the premium. And for the very largest schemes, insurers will go out and will source a portfolio of matching assets. And clearly with that kind of power in a way, comes some responsibility to really understand where you are and really select your options at outset. So the level of preparation and the type of preparation and also the process that is followed, both for the broking and then for the implementation of a contract, is fundamentally different. And trustees and sponsors really need to understand which segment the scheme belongs to, because that will have very fundamental impact on what is done.
Okay, thanks Tiziana. The next question we have is, should trustees consider ESG as part of buyout provider considerations?
Yeah, I'll take that as well. So really, realistically, price is the main selection factor for trustees, and that is not likely to change. But I've seen a growing appetite for trustees or trustee boards to take full insurer due diligence, which actually I think is a great development, because you are passing all your assets across and you are relying on a third party to look after your members for 30, 40, 50 years. And really not to do that level of due diligence, I just don't think is right. And one important part of that due diligence is, again, looking at insurers' ESG type credentials. And I think that, generally they are good, particularly because a lot of the insurer investment, particularly in recent years, the sort of higher yielding infrastructure projects they've been able to invest in, they've got inherent green credentials, so that the insurance market can present actually quite a good story. I think this is something that insurers are taking very seriously indeed, not just in what they do, but also kind of making it easier to report back, so that trustees really can understand and can also compare. But it's really realistically, it's not going to be one of the key selection criteria. It's not now, and probably it's never going to be that.
Okay, thanks Tiziana again. Next question, have you seen many transactions not proceed, and why would that happen?
So I'll take that, Charles, given that I've done quite a lot of transactions. Yeah, absolutely. It does happen. Not very often on my scheme. On my schemes, I'm pleased to report. I think that really we go back to poor preparation. For example, if there are any last minute data issues that are identified and all of a sudden you thought you were fully funded and you're not, or maybe you don't even know how well funded you are because you don't know the quantum of the importance of these issues that you have identified. And then the other one that really can kind of scupper transaction is having mismatched assets. You get the quotation, potentially you pre-select an insurer, but your assets don't move in line with the insurer pricing. And then over those 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks that you may take to finalize and negotiate a contract, the price lock that you've been given was maybe not quite as good a match as it should have been, and all of a sudden again affordability has moved away from you. It's a mature market now, and I think that insurers are entitled to expect good preparation from pension schemes. I think that insurers are very good and very supportive, but as I was saying earlier, they do have long memories, so it is really bad. You can never manage absolutely everything and say, well, it's never happened to me before and it's never going to happen. You can never say that. But I think that, if you have done all your work and if it's something unprecedented, then there's not a lot that can be done. And just say a word maybe on volatility here, given the current environment. Actually, some volatility, can be good, in terms of pricing. Okay, you should not play on volatility and having mismatched assets in the hope that that volatility, will deliver a transactable price. But sometimes just the market conditions and just the way that you're matching assets move not quite in line with insurer pricing can give you that extra uplift of a few percent, can make a difference between a good price and an absolutely amazing price. You cannot plan for that. Again, that's something that sometimes does happen when you are in the market, but it is actually very nice when it happens.
Thanks, Tiziana. The next question is, what types of endgame are defined benefit scheme trustees opting for?
Yeah, shall I take this one? I think, as I mentioned earlier, buyout, or at least partial buyout, is still where most schemes are going. It achieves, obviously, good security for members, and in the vast majority of situations is an improvement in the security of members' benefits. There are very few small exceptions, but for most, it's an improvement. Clearly, from a trustee perspective, it's making sure that we've achieved or hit our responsibilities and delivered benefits to members in the most secure way we can. And for many sponsors, particularly where a scheme is pretty much fully funded to buy it, it achieves their objective of closing off that liability at the appropriate time. I think the interesting one for many schemes, particularly given the improvements in funding we've seen in recent months, is those schemes that have been targeting self-sufficiency and nothing beyond that, because many schemes have actually either got there or very close to it, and are now grappling with that next step of where to go next, because ultimately, from here, in order to take that next step, if buyout is that next step, they either need more cash from the sponsor or need to invest, which brings with it risk. And so many schemes, I think, are grappling with that decision of what to do next once they reach self-sufficiency, whereas maybe 2 or 3 or even 4 years ago, most were looking at self-sufficiency as something that was some way off. So interesting time for those schemes that have got themselves into that position. Some, as I mentioned earlier, are looking at capital-backed solutions to help them with that next step, to take the final step towards buyout. And for those which or where the circumstances are such that the employer can't contribute anymore, then looking at the super funds, the consolidators is the option for them. But admittedly, that is quite a niche market with that works for a relatively limited set of circumstances.
Thanks, Charles. I think we've got time for one more question. How do you decide on whether to go for successive buy-ins rather than a single transaction at the end?
I'll take this one, Tiziana. finish off. Yeah, interesting. I think size is a key factor here, because I think particularly for smaller schemes, and when I say smaller, we're talking kind of sub 100 or sub 50 million. Actually, partial buy-ins can be quite problematic because you're left with a relatively small rump of liabilities to deal with at a later date. So size is certainly a factor, because you want to make sure that each kind of tranche that you take to the insurer is attractive and is business that they want to do. And then if you are looking at a strategy of successive buy-ins, the question is, what level of investment risk and investment strategy do you want to pursue in order to close the gap for whatever's left within the scheme after that initial tranche of buy-in? Because essentially what you're doing, the more buy-in you do now, the more kind of extra return potentially you're sacrificing for the remaining assets. The other factor, given the improvements in scheme funding we've seen recently, is that as schemes have got better funded, actually many schemes which were considering a series of buy-ins are actually in a position now to do a much bigger one-off transaction, potentially the whole scheme. And so some of those that were thinking about that tranching have moved quite quickly to doing the whole thing. And the other factor which drove particularly pensioner buy-ins was the relatively high cost of deferred pensioner insurance. That, as Tiziana mentioned earlier, has come in quite a lot. And so for those schemes that saw that as quite a big jump, that improvement in deferred pricing in particular has actually turned some of those schemes towards a full scheme buyout rather than a phased series of buy-ins. Okay, Tiziana.
Yeah,
okay, so I think that takes us to the end of the session. So I just close by thanking everyone for attending, and any questions, by all means, do get in touch. Be happy to discuss this further.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.